July 2nd marks the 50th anniversary of the signing of the landmark Civil Rights Act intended to virtually eliminate all forms of discrimination.
That was the intention. The battle for civil rights was long and bloody. In tonight's cover story, WGN Steve Sanders looks at the Chicago events and people who sparked history while making change more than a half-century ago.
This is the first day of the sit-in, January 2nd, 1962.
Big movements sometimes begin with what seem like small events.
This history had been buried for 50 years.
Genealogist and author Tony Burroughs was a 12-year-old student at Chicago's Burnside Elementary School when his mother and other PTA mothers bravely staged sit-ins. Burnside was overcrowded, but the school board's solution was to transfer only the black kids to another school.
When they said they was going to send them there, we didn't want them to go, and that's when we started. We couldn't reason with the principal.
For 3 weeks in the dead of winter, the mothers carried picket signs and staged sit-ins outside the principal's office. Though Tony's own mother looked like anything but a troublemaker in her pearl necklace and Sunday best, she and the others were arrested, fingerprinted, and bundled off to jail.
I'd never been in a paddy wagon in my life. Cold, stinking, oh my. But we had some mothers in there that were praying.
I don't have any regrets.
That was Irene Simmons wearing the pillbox hat in the large photo over Burnside's main stairwell. That space now holds a colorful mosaic mural commemorating those brave mothers now well into their 80s. They came back to the school on June 5th to hear Burroughs describe the sit-ins as the spark that ignited the civil rights movement in Chicago.
It was the mothers and fathers' fight at Burnside that eventually led to a citywide boycott the following year, where over 200,000 students boycotted Chicago public schools.
But in the Deep South, the place from where generations of black Chicagoans had migrated over the past half-century, racial segregation involved much more than schools.
There was an apartheid system where there was a complete separation of blacks and whites. You have to understand when you deal with the 1964 Civil Rights Act that black people as a group were considered inhuman.
Chicago attorney Thomas Todd grew up in Alabama and moved to Chicago after the Civil Rights Act was signed. He says back then the civil rights movement had plenty of protesters. They needed black attorneys to make sure the laws were enforced.
It was against the law for blacks to drink out of a white water fountain, and you could be put in jail for doing that. So we had to be taught how not only to live as a child, but also how to be mindful of these traps.
One of those traps ensnared a 14-year-old Chicago boy visiting Mississippi relatives in the summer of 1955. 4 days after Emmett Till was accused of flirting with a white woman, he was kidnapped, tortured, and murdered by 2 white men who were later acquitted by an all-white jury. Emmett Till's open casket funeral focused a national spotlight on the empty promise of racial equality and began to embolden African Americans. The Reverend Jesse Jackson recalls the one event that would spark his career as a lifelong civil rights leader. In 1960, he and 7 classmates were arrested in his hometown of Greenville, South Carolina.
I'm not going to serve you because of my race. Move on.
Increasingly, legal segregation was no longer to be ignored. Blacks boycotted buses in Montgomery, Alabama, protested segregated lunch counters in Birmingham, and conducted voter registration drives throughout the Deep South. But white segregationists were pushing back.
You've got to keep the white and the black separate.
With moral cover from segregationist politicians, African Americans were routinely attacked, jailed, bombed, and murdered. Protest marches were peaceful, but reaction to them was often violent. But it may have taken the murder of a U.S. president to clear the way for John F. Kennedy's Southern-born successor to find enough support to pass a long-stalled bill to end legal segregation.
No memorial oration or eulogy could more eloquently honor President Kennedy's memory than the earliest possible passage of the Civil Rights Bill for which he fought so long.
An unlikely standard bearer for civil rights, President Lyndon Johnson used his well-honed legislative skills to get the law passed.
Now, in this summer of 1964, the Civil Rights Bill is the law of the land.
Kennedy died as a martyr
and we embrace his legacy and his promise. But Johnson delivered in ways no one other than Abraham Lincoln ever delivered. What's the marvel is we've gone from being denied the right to vote from the balcony in Memphis to the White House in 50 years. This has been an ongoing continuum to make America better.
I have a dream.
Events big and small, all adding up to an important 50th anniversary that came 2.5 years after dedicated Chicago mothers sat down on behalf of their children at Burnside Elementary School on Chicago's South Side.
To me, to sit down and look at these walls and see my photo on the wall, see my mother's photo on the wall, see these other mothers and students on the wall, it's just amazing. It's amazing.
Steve Sanders, WGN News.
Earlier this year, attorney Thomas Todd donated many of his civil rights artifacts to Chicago State University. You can hear why in a web extra.
You can also hear an extended interview with Reverend Jackson, including his one regret. That's at WGN-TV.com.